to watch these gulls. I'm going to present you with a challenge tonight. I want you to think of, is there another group of birds equally at home on land, air, and water as gulls? Is there another group of birds that is as diversified as gulls? Let's talk about some of the habitats these birds exploit. The Arctic, coastlines, ag fields, rocky islands, rooftops. And then the diets are so varied. Crab apples, full diapers, grain, crustaceans, French fries. There's few things they won't eat. But again, we're not talking about all gulls. And they're always watching. They're always watching. They've taken to our presence. They don't have a problem with us, most of them. And I think this is one of the things that attracted me to gulls, is that they're so accessible. And there is a puzzle there. There's a puzzle waiting to be solved. So as far as, are gulls their own family? No, they're a subfamily. They belong in the same family as terns, noddies, skimmers. But they do comprise about 52 species, give or take. Last year was 54, this year it's 52. Under 11 genera, and the largest genus is the Laris, and these are the troublemakers, the large 4-cycle gulls, 3-cycle gulls. There's about 25 species in Laris. And the two groupings I want you to think about tonight are large white-headed gulls, things like Iceland, the blackbacks, Western California, and then the small tern-like gulls, the nimble Bonapartes, black-headed, little gull, kittiwakes. So we should probably identify these two here. This is our largest gull in the world and smallest gull in the world. The one on the left is a great blackback, and on the right is a little gull. Yeah. And so these two were once placed in the same genus. Up until about 20 years ago, little gull was a Laris species. And it's just in the last couple of decades that their phylogenies are becoming a little clearer. And many of these small gulls now belong in a different genus. Interestingly, the smaller gulls, Bonapartes, little gull, they mature a lot faster, about 2 years faster on average. This is a 1st-cycle Bonapartes on the right here, and it already has a gray back. Whereas most 1st-cycle 4-year gulls are going to have these mottled brown plumages. So here's a question to begin with the aging component of this talk. Why do gulls require more than a year to maturate? And other groups of birds like bald eagles or even Jaegers, why do they require several years? What could be one of the explanations for this? Yeah.
Is it related to the overall lifespan, about which I don't know anything about these birds?
Yeah, that's given as a reason. One of the life history of these birds. 40-year-old average lifespan for herring gull. Paper just published 2 years ago. 40 years old in a colony in the Netherlands was the average lifespan for herring gulls banded in the 70s. So this is incredible information. I have the actual longest living herring gull in North America recorded in Michigan. It was a bird a couple months shy of 30 years old, banded in Green Bay and found about 250 miles south of its natal colony, almost 30 years old. So the life history, these birds having longer lifespans. Bonapartes on average will live about 15 years, 18 years. Something like a ring-billed gull, about 20 to 25 years. And great blackbacks, herrings, these larger 4-year gulls will live 35 to 40 years. So a good way to group these birds is the number of cycles it takes or number of years it takes to become adult-like. And those in red there, for us out in the east, would be good benchmark species. to keep in mind. The small tern-like gulls, this is the primitive group. This is the older group of gulls. Their phylogeny has been worked out nicely. We don't have much problems identifying them. Most of them are 2-year species, 18 months, and they're adult-like. My favorite of them is the Bonaparte's gull, which may soon become boreal gull. That's a suggested name and a serious name for this one. They nest in black spruce trees. This is the only gull in the world that regularly nests in trees, right? I mean, they prefer not to nest anywhere else than trees. So the interesting gull.
That's our club bird.
Did you know that that was our club book? Like, are you trying to get in good?
Yeah, I'm hoping someone will give me a hat on the way out.
What color would you like? Dude, you're getting a hat on.
I'll
the way
take
out.
brown and gray. Thank you. No, get out of here. So there's actually no nesting Bonapartes anywhere in the US. Did you guys know this? There's one pair in Maine that nested about 3 years ago. It tried again last year and failed. But there's only one pair in Maine, and it's not a consistent, regular thing. I'm sworn to secrecy.
My sister lives in Lubeck.
I'll tell you later.
Northern Maine.
Northern Maine, yeah, in that forest.
Yeah.
So it's mainly a tundra breeder. And this is actually its closest relative from the old world, black-headed gull. These photos were taken in Baltimore. I took both of these about 4 months apart. I was out visiting family in Baltimore in December. That's the one on the right there, non-breeding plumage, basic plumage. And then 4 months later, it came back. I was like, I think I'll drive out there again from Chicago. Did a 10-hour drive to get this alternate plumage black-headed gull. They named this thing Popcorn, and it came back for about 12 years, which is not uncommon with gulls. They're like clockwork. They come back to these winter haunts and summer haunts like year after year. On that note, there's a great blackback gull in Pueblo County, Colorado, that's come back this year for the 31st winter. Pueblo County, Colorado. Small little lake in Pueblo County, 31 years this bird has returned to winter. It's incredible. So there are lots of records like this with gulls, and citizen scientists are on the move, recording these things in eBay and using social media. These 4 here are gems. Ken Kaufman said these birds had better voices. He wouldn't need any other birds, just these 4. I've seen all of these. These aren't my photos, however. Sabins is just a stunner, a stunning geometry of black, gray, and white triangles. This is our longest migrating gull. So this map that you're seeing is from a study about 6-7 years ago where they fitted a mated pair, adult male, adult female Sabins on a nest with GPS trackers. They found that the female migrated to the Humboldt Current off South America, and the male migrated to South Africa. And then these birds regrouped the previous or the next summer, and they found them on the same little spit. Yeah. So this was, I think, the first documentation of 2 adults taking divergent migratory pathways, regrouping, and nesting at the same colony.
They like their separate winter vacations.
They're quite loyal. They're actually loyal. I have in the book there 22-year-old Sabins. Refound at the same colony. It was banded as a trick, and then 22 years later, found it in the same colony. I'm going to talk a little bit about hooded gulls. These are fun. You guys get laughing gulls. Franklin's is probably pretty rare anywhere this far east. But you know, you get these fronts, I call them Franklin's fronts in October, where they occasionally do make it to the Atlantic. But you know, if you're traveling in the interior, these birds, Franklin's is pretty much right down the interior, the Great Basin and the prairie potholes. You'll notice it has a medial band on the wingtip. They generally show more white on the wingtip, and they always have this nice demarcated hood right off the back of the head here. This is almost month for month, you'll find this with most francolins. And they have these bold eye arcs. And one thing a lot of people have never noticed about adult francolins is that the adults have gray on the tail. It's an overlooked field mark. And one of the suggested names for this one is gray-tailed gull. Gray-tailed gull. Laughing never shows any gray on the wingtip, and notice Laughing's wingtip just goes from black to gray. So this is a different type of bird in the middle here. It has that white wedge. Uh-oh, I shouldn't be quizzing you guys on this bird because this is your bird. Bonaparte's actually is not a hooded gull, it's a masked gull. It's a different group of birds. They don't show white on the trailing edge. Most of these masked gulls, black-headed gull, Bonaparte's gull, and a lot of those southern hemisphere masked gulls, they don't have that white trailing edge like Laughing and Franklin's and some of the large gulls. So here's a neat close-up of Franklin's with a bunch of Laughing. Notice that hood and the bold eye arcs on that Franklin's. They also tend to show bigger spots on the primary tips. And those are called apicals. This is a lot more fun when you have young birds. One of these is a Franklin's.
Which one?
Take that month for month, they'll show more black on the head and they'll have bolder eye arcs. Just a little bit right of center. Can we see that? So my, you guys wouldn't believe me if I told you this, but my cursor is nowhere to be found on this screen. So I'm just going to try to point and I can't. So this is our Franklin's right here. I hope you can see that. This is in Florida. Daytona Beach Shores has anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 laughing gulls that winter there. This stretch of beach about 2 miles. And for as far as you can see, laughing gulls. It's the biggest congregation of laughing gulls in North America. And in that group, they usually find 3 or 4 Franklins, and that's the muse of their winter gull watching down there. We just pick out a Franklin's in the 50,000 plus laughing gulls. In flight, Franklin's generally doesn't have black go out to the outer tail feathers. So which one's Franklin's here, left or right?
Left.
Yeah. Again, the hood pattern is helpful, but the tail in flight is generally what we're looking at with Franklin's. Okay. On to the fun stuff. So the large white-headed gulls, you'll see this abbreviated LWHG sometimes. A lot of them overlap. A lot of them have features that more or less look like your typical terrestrial seagull, right? Yellow beak, white head, gray back. Most of these are going to take 4 to 5 years before they start breeding. Maybe we should try identifying what's on this slide. One of them is a herring gull. And one of them is an Iceland gull. The lower one is Iceland. Yeah. So we focus on the primaries. We're going to be looking, especially at a distance, at these wingtips, right? If you can make out eye color from a distance, that's helpful. But Iceland gulls actually can span from pale-eyed to dark-eyed. There is no just dark-eyed coomlings. That's a misconception. And there is no just dark-eyed thayers. About 20% of thayers have pale eyes. And maybe 20 to 30% of coomlings have dark eyes. So how do we tell them apart? We get into the nitty-gritty of these wingtip patterns. They're lots of fun. Can you notice this gray is a little bit paler backed? I know your monitor over there, guys, is a mess for gull watching. You're out there watching, and
This angle looks great. Yeah.
You're out there in bright conditions. You have a sunny day there. We have perfect lighting here. The back on this Iceland is a little bit paler than the herring. But also we look at the underside of this far wing. And it's hard to see here because of the snow, but the underside here is white. And the underside on herring will generally show more black. That's just one of the things folks are looking at when they're trying to identify Iceland gulls by wingtip pattern. Among these large 4-year gulls, we have broad groupings called the blackbacks and white wingers. The white wingers are things like glaucus, glaucus winged, and Iceland gull. And the blackbacks, there's a number of those: lesser, great, western, slatyback. Anything with a black back is a blackback. And these are just loose terms that gull nuts will use. I have a blackback, I have a white winger. So to quantify these things, we have the Kodak grayscale from 0 to 19. 0 is ivory gull. That's the only gull assigned to 0. And there's actually no gull in North America that surpasses 15. So our great blackback gull ranges from 13 to 15. Nobody actually uses these numbers in the field. We're not out there saying I score that one a 7, that one's an 8. I give her a 9. So these are mainly for like museum specimens and when we're looking at things in articles and papers and stuff. But here's an example: 3 very common North American gulls. The one in the back, the larger one, is a glaucus winged. This is a bird you're going to see anywhere in Alaska, the Pacific Northwest, and they winter down to Central California and Southern California. Their wingtips are gray-ish, not black, and they have a medium gray back. The one in the center, palest, that's a herring gull, and the one in the front is sort of a treat in the east. Has dark eyes, yellowish green legs, darker back. What's the one in the front there? California, yeah. So they have this nice seasonal field mark with a black to red pattern on the bill tip. And that's just for like 6-7 months. And then they go all yellow bill with a red goney spot. Those are the Kodak grayscale values for those 3. Interestingly, most gulls in the west, say from the Colorado Front Range and west, have variable upper parts. So these 2 are also California gulls. The one on the left is probably the smaller nominate subspecies, Californicus. The one on the right is the bigger Alberta subspecies. They're paler. They can be just as large as herring gulls. And in general, on the Great Lakes where I live, we usually get these paler ones, larger ones that kind of mix in with the herring gulls. But notice the leg color, right? Yeah, leg color is a clincher. You're not going to have herring gulls with yellow legs, or you shouldn't. These are glaucus gulls, just to show some of the variation in size and upper part coloration. Glaucus gull breeds all throughout the Arctic, from Russia to Greenland, northern Canada. We have 2 subspecies in North America. We have Borovianus, found on the North Slope, the Mackenzie Delta, and we have Luceretes, which breeds in Arctic Canada. The one on the left there is Luceretes, and the one on the right is the Barrow subspecies. It's the smallest glaucus gull. These 2 in time might prove to be 2 different species. There's work being done on glaucus gulls in Europe right now with the nominate subspecies, and it is really weird stuff. Like the glaucus gulls in Arctic Canada appear to be more closely related to American herring gull than they do to glaucus gulls in Europe. So there's some neat stuff going on there, and we may have a couple glaucus gulls out there. All right, some advice for approaching large white-headed gulls. Are you guys ready? Ready to take these notes? Allow for variation. And then allow for variation. And allow for variation. The thing about gulls is, and this is why I find them fascinating, There is no Kaufman or Sibley or National Geographic guide that can teach this sort of variation. It's not slight variation, it's for some of these taxa, herring gulls, lesser blackbacks in their earlier plumages, first year, second year, almost anything is possible when you look at the array of variation in their patterns. So what you do is you watch 50 of them, 100 of them, and you say, okay, I've seen these sort of scapulars on a lesser blackback before. And I think it's acceptable. Everything else looks like a lesser blackback. It's a lesser blackback. So the patterns on their coverts, on their upper tail coverts are so variable. But if you're just starting with gulls, you begin with the adults, right? You don't begin with first year birds. Although they're fun, you want to really get a handle on your common adults that you're seeing 90% of the time. Size variation, males in the large white-headed gulls can be 25 to 30% larger than females. As a general rule, males are larger than females. If you're ever in doubt, and it's April, May-ish, you stick around long enough, there'll be no question. So white wingers, back to these Arctic denizens, we have a glaucous gull on the left and an Iceland gull, the Kumleen subspecies. Kumleen breeds mainly on Southampton Island, Baffin Island, and it's a problematic bird. It may be a hybrid, it may be a incipient species. We don't know what Kumleen's really is. Right now, it's a subspecies of Iceland gull. But I want you to notice how much bigger glaucous gull is. It's the second biggest gull in the world. But here's another glaucous gull that's just about the same size as a herring gull. So we might say the one on the left there, that glaucous gull, may be a female, and that might be a brute male herring. And so why isn't that an Iceland gull? That's a good question. For those of you who know Iceland gulls, they make winter gull watching really fun. Why isn't the one on the left an Iceland gull? What's the main giveaway? The bill pattern, yeah. So generally speaking, our Iceland gulls in North America are going to keep a mostly black bill for most of the winter, right? By the time they leave here, it may start paling at the base, but they generally don't show this sharp demarcated bill pattern. So that's a giveaway there. The bill pattern. Yep. Plumage variation. These are herring gulls, probably the same age, give or take a couple weeks. This is what our Great Lakes herring gulls look like in November. And just look at that. That's phenomenal variation there. Bicolored bill for the one on the right, black bill for the one on the left. Brown scapular centers for the one on the left. Brown wing panel. It's just a completely different look, but they fall under the same mold. These are just typical Great Lakes herrings. Ring-billed gulls, same age group. These are first cycle birds found in Florida in January. The one on the left has just kept a lot of its juvenile breast feathers, head feathers. The one on the right has molted into its first alternate plumage. First cycle ring-billed gulls. The smaller the species, like these Bonapartes here, the less variation we find, right? As a rule, the smaller the species, the less variation in gulls, okay? So the masked gulls, the small tern-like gulls, they generally don't present any ID problems. They have shorter lifespans and they do have more restricted diets, don't they? Herring gulls are great parents. This individual here dive bombed me, and I swear I may have gotten a concussion from it. This is in Indiana. We're counting nests, and all I hear is, watch out. Yeah. But I want you to appreciate some of the cryptic plumages in these juveniles. I've never seen a juvenile against like a pale background they almost always blend in with either branches, fallen logs, the soil. This is a fuzzy, downy, ring-billed gull. And these are herring gulls on an island on Lake Erie, where we banned in the summer. Can you count all those juvenile herrings? You guys might have a better shot now. $54. No, I'm kidding. All right, yeah, the highest I've ever heard was 11, but I've only found 9. Anywho, so they have these cool cryptic plumages. We go back to this question of why do they have these plumages for a number of years? So like, what is the purpose? Maybe somebody here can actually help me out. What is the purpose of having these subadult plumages? Why can't they just molt into adult plumage? Why does it take 3-4 years of these successive subadult plumages?
So they can judge the age of other individuals and
Okay.
determine whether they're competitors.
Signals in the flock, like in the,
And there are a lot of social interactions, like, often if you're an adult, you're more of an adversary. So if you sort of keep this juvenile plumage, you're less of a threat to adults, and you can kind of get by hanging out in the crowd without getting beaten up.
yeah. You hang around the
One
periphery of the colony and you're not a threat to the adults.
Yeah.
Interesting. Interesting, yeah. So these birds, these subadult birds, literally don't have the functioning reproductive organs most of the time to breed. So an interesting fact about these, I heard people talking about bear parts earlier with the peregrine falcon. I found that fascinating because a lot of cool things happen with bear parts. And we say bear parts, we mean orbital rings, bill color, leg color. A lot of neat things are happening with just studying these colors and why there's variation in these colors. But there is some thought out there that says these might be under sexual selection. The Kumlin's in the front there has pink orbital, and the herring has an orange-yellow orbital ring. And usually in the breeding season, their gape line, the base of the mouth there, will be the same color as these orbitals. The brighter these orbitals, it seems, the more successful they are at having larger broods. In general, there was a study done on lesser blackback gulls in Germany, 20-year study, and they averaged larger broods when they have brighter orbital rings at the onset of the breeding season.
Beauty wins.
All right, we're gonna do some technical stuff here. Because you guys like this and you volunteered to come here, we should know some of the feather groups, right? I think if you're reading an article about gull identification or just following some of these online eBird lists, somebody starts talking about P1 and P4 and greater coverts, we should have a general sense of where these feather groups are, and I'm sure many of you do. The scapulars are the back feathers. They're kind of what close that gap between the wing and the actual back. And these are usually the first feathers to start molting in gulls. The scapulars are the first feathers usually to be replaced along with the head feathers. The wing panel there is made up of lesser coverts, median coverts, and greater coverts. And these are going to be protecting the bases of the flight feathers, mainly the secondaries. The tertials are a nice conspicuous group of feathers. These are pretty important with small gulls. Lots of patterns deciphered from those tertials. This long group of feathers here, this is not the tail. These are the primaries, right? These are the longest flight feathers, and we number them from P1 all the way to P10. I'm going to show you an open wing in a second, but this is the underside of the far wing. I mentioned that earlier when I showed that bears and herring slide. This is a really good place to be looking with large gulls, right? The pattern that you see on the underside here is often very helpful with large gulls. So the open wing, the primaries, as I mentioned, are numbered from P1 all the way out to the 10th primary. I don't think this is a gull's wing. Why not?
Because,
Yeah.
yeah, P10 is way too short.
Yeah. So these outer P9, P8s, P10s, they should be much longer. And they tend to have more pointy wings, right? So I don't know what this is. Anybody want to take a guess what you think that might be? I'm not sure. Grouse, something molting, P9, P10, growing P9, P10. But notice these secondaries are also in gulls. There can be 16 to 23 secondaries, depending on the species. Smaller species, 16-ish. Larger species can be 20, 23. The tertials, some people refer to these as the innermost secondaries. They're not really secondaries, but they're adjacent to the secondaries. We're going to do a quiz, so make sure you know what you're looking at here. I meant that. Let's go with feather group 9. What are those? Those are the feathers that close up that gap between the back and the wing. Yeah, those are the scapulars. And there are short scapulars and longer scapulars. The ones down here will be the longest scapulars. And again, with gulls, mainly younger gulls, it's an important feather group because usually they're the first to molt, and we get new patterns as soon as they molt. Feather group 1. The primaries, yep. Feather group 4. Secondaries, 8. Tertials. Oh, you guys are experts. I didn't have to quiz you. How about 7? The lesser coverts, 8.
No. Or do you mean 6, or did you go back to 8 for tertials?
Yeah, just seeing who's listening here. I thought we were gonna play nice. All right. Let's go 6. The median coverage, thank you. 5. The greater coverage. Yeah, those are the longest coverage. How about 2?
Primary coverage.
Those are the primary coverts. And we have a bonus here, number 3.
Alula.
Yeah, alula. It's like the rudder, right? You see raptors sometimes, even gulls, they'll pop it out in flight and turn on a dime. So variation, I'm gonna close, I think, in about 2 hours. How much time have I got left? Can I just get time? How much time you guys have here? Your folks at
Another 15 minutes.
15, you got it. So that variation I was talking about with large gulls oftentimes comes down to not just size and the colors of their backs, but their wingtip patterns. And so it's thought in these large 4-cycle gulls, the older the adult, the less black it shows in a wingtip. These are both slaty back gulls. This is an Asian, primarily Asian breeder, but there are some that breed in Alaska. They've made this incursion slowly but surely to North America, where now there's probably a dozen or so seen in the lower 48 every winter. And the Great Lakes, places like Michigan now, there's sites where they're seeing 2 at a time for the first time ever. So Muskegon wastewater treatment plants, pretty interesting. So what are they doing? Are they breeding somewhere else in Canada? Maybe. But my point here is this individual might just be a very young adult. This one here with all this black. If you know slaty back gull, you're expecting a lot of string of pearl pattern here, and it's not very gaudy. It's not very interesting like this bird. Back to European studies, because they study gulls like crazy. They banned like 10% of their gulls. They put field breedable bands on them, and birders there are like really into finding banded gulls and reporting them. And they have these databases of like, you report a band and you can see a bird like the last 12 times it was seen in France, and then it was seen in Belgium, and then it was seen in Portugal. So they do this and they enjoy reporting these gulls. A study on common gulls, Larus canis, was done over 27 years. And they found, it is true, they lose black in the wingtip as they age. But females, interestingly, once they surpass their like reproductive, the peak of their reproduction years, they start to gain black back again. So they peak, they get a lot of white in the wingtip, and then in their last years, they start to gain some more black. Anywho, do we know how old this individual is? It could be 4, it could be 5 years old, it could be 10 years old. Nobody really knows. This adult could be 4, could be 5, it could be 20 years old, we don't know. But as a general rule, the more white in the wingtip, the older we believe that bird is. Now, there is a caveat. Herring gulls in North America, in the east, show more white in the wingtip. So your herring gulls, today I was in Delaware, next to a landfill, spying herring gulls, and I was amazed by the amount of white in the wingtip. Because the Great Lakes herrings, the Alaskan herrings, they generally don't show a lot of white in the wingtip. So there is this variation from east to west, and it's not age related.
Yeah, Mark.
Yeah.
Just a comment on Zoom. When you have 2 photos, can you say left or right
Oh, certainly.
for people on Zoom?
Yeah, so that bird on the left there, folks, is most likely, if I had to guess, an older adult. That is a lot of white in the wingtip. And the bird on the right shows extensive black, and so it's probably a younger elder, if that makes sense. Yeah, you're welcome. We're going to talk about molt for about 5 minutes, because if you don't molt, you die. Does anyone get this reference, molt or die? You got to be like in your mid 30s, 40s. Skate or die?
Oh, okay.
All right. That's not cool. So anyway, you guys know this, and I'm sure Jason knows this. If a bird doesn't molt, what happens?
Die.
They die. Right? I mean, there is no exception to that rule, right? Like there's this annual process, it's a molt cycle, and birds have to replace their feathers to stay healthy, to stay safe. There are birds that may take sabbaticals and not breed for a year or 2 or 3 or 4. There are birds that might not migrate if they can find a sufficient food source, but no bird can forego molting. They have to molt annually. So what are some of the things that may happen if they don't molt? They
get wet, they freeze.
they can't insulate themselves, they freeze.
Fly.
They can't fly, they become flightless, susceptible to predators. Overtaken by parasites, I won't get into that, but it's a nightmare. And you can usually tell with gulls, and that's why I was interested in this palm jaeger you guys had, that it almost sounds like a cry for help, that it's still just sitting on the beach, but it has this nice plumage. It's really weird, because usually birds that are in trouble, you can pick up some clues, some other clues. The plumage is in bad shape. But this thing apparently is just, it didn't get the memo about harassing gulls, which is pretty strange, because this is what they do for a living. They should be harassing gulls and terns. So at any rate, 2 main molts. This is based on Humphrey Park's terminology. So with gulls, you'll see in the book and a lot of other references, we usually don't use breeding and non-breeding with gulls. We use basic plumage, alternate plumage. And this is just a more convenient way to name plumages. Is there a reason why we would avoid breeding plumage, non-breeding plumage with gulls? Like, where might that fall apart?
Too noisy, but they also, maybe they don't breed that good.
Yeah, right. There's subadults, right? There's like 2-3 years for the herring gull not breeding. So it's not only a misnomer, it's just not precise. Yeah. So the basic plumage is this, let's call it the default plumage that all birds share in common. And the first basic plumage that a bird is wearing is its juvenile plumage. So juvenile plumage is equivalent to first basic plumage. That's its name. First set of true feathers that bird fledges with, it's called the first basic plumage. And then shortly after that, they go through some partial molts. We're talking about gulls. And those partial molts are called pre-alternate molts. Okay. With gulls in the northern hemisphere, this complete molt usually is from mid-spring through early fall. And the pre-alternate molt overlaps at times with the pre-basic molt. And that's usually September through April. So pre-alternate molt is what most people are going to associate with resulting in an alternate or breeding plumage. Okay, so what's happening here? On the left there, that bird is in its pre-basic molt. It's a mess. Every feather track is seeing some type of molt. And then when that molt is complete, it's in its basic plumage. So right now, most of our gulls are wearing basic plumage or non-breeding plumage. Great time of year to study them because all the pieces are there. Nothing is missing. Nice, crisp plumages. Later in the spring, say April, most of them will be undergoing this partial molt, losing the head streaking, and that's about all. Maybe some wing coverts, but they won't be replacing flight feathers in the partial molt. They only replace body feathers in the partial molt, most gulls. Okay. This was actually the one on the left was New Jersey, July, and the one on the right is Illinois, December. But they're lesser blackbacks. And is the one on the left an adult? No, right? That can't be an adult with the brown on the tail, the brown outer primaries. That's not an adult. Is the one on the right an adult? Looks safe, looks pretty good. White on the tail, all white tail. It's showing this, what is this white spot called? Showing a mirror. So some adults, like in their third cycle, can show mirrors, but this is a pretty safe adult here. All right, we're gonna just end with this aging takeaway. A molt cycle typically aligns to an annual cycle with most birds. It's an annual cycle, but there are some birds that molt over 9 months, a complete molt in 9 months. And it encompasses one pre-basic molt to the next. So the start of a molt cycle is initiated by this pre-basic molt. So when you ask, how do you know this bird is in its second cycle? It's because it's begun its second pre-basic molt. How do we know this bird is in its third cycle? It's because it's begun its third pre-basic molt. And with gulls, this is a lot of fun. It's easy to tell because they're big, they're out in the open. When you see those inner primaries starting to drop and molt, usually in May, the next pre-basic molt has begun. So great time to pick up on these things in early spring when everybody's looking at warblers in May. Just observe these gulls flying around. And if you see that gap at the inner wing here, they've begun their next pre-basic molt, their next molt cycle. Okay. I think I'm just going to stop here because we don't want to get too vain here. Yeah, so that's probably good for people at home if they had questions or if you guys had any questions. I hope you have some good nuggets to walk away with here. Something to think about. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
The gulls.
Thank you. I'm sure all of us learned a lot from your talk, but I'm sure we can learn a lot more from your book. But are there any questions in the room? And people on Zoom, please post your questions to Zoom and on the chat or raise your hands and I'll read them out. Any questions in the room? Right.
Just a quick note there, in your book, in the topography and here, you did not stress anything about identification using secondary flight feathers. Is that, obviously the primary and the bare parts are very good field marks. What do you think about secondaries, especially like a Franklin skull, as opposed to you know, a laughing gull or what have you.
Yeah, they generally with adults don't do much. With adult birds, they generally don't do much. But in first year Franklin's, first year laughing, yeah, I could see some usefulness there. First year Franklin's has more white on the trailing edge of the secondaries. Franklin's tends to be, it looks more mature in general. It looks more like a second year bird. I can pull up that slide and show you, but that's interesting that you noted there wasn't much said about secondaries. In general, I can think of a couple instances where it might be useful, but in general, it's the outer primaries and the tail. So yeah, you notice on the left bird here, the Franklin's, the trailing edge looks a little more mature, more white. So when I say a little more mature, it looks more like a second year bird than it does. Interesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just a comment.
Yeah, California gull is another one where the secondaries might be useful in first year. So somebody out west is probably looking at, we call it a double secondary bar. The secondaries are dark and the greater coverts are dark, and it looks like two bars on the trailing edge. Yeah, but other than that, I can't think of a lot of instances where it's like diagnostic or very helpful in ID. You know. Yeah.
So in many of these cases where you've shown side by side comparisons and they look pretty similar to my eye, were you able to take, like make that differentiation on the spot, or is it after looking at photographs?
Yeah, oftentimes I have to take things home and dissect the photographs on a screen. Yeah, unfortunately, you know, gulls being so big, you don't have to be a great photographer to take gull photos. So like, there are some things, you know, in the field, and then there's some things you're gonna take home, and that's part of the fun, is taking home the photos and zooming in and trying to figure out what it is exactly that you saw in the field. So it's a little bit of both.
And can I just follow that up with actually, something you told me in the elevator is probably worth saying here,
Yeah,
which is how the gulls come back to the same watering spot every day. So if you go over and over again, you
Yeah.
can actually see the same bird and watch it change.
Yeah,
I think that
so-
was a really
Wait a minute,
interesting.
can you repeat the question for people on?
yeah, so, I made a comment earlier today when we were walking up here. There are places you can go and stalk your common gulls, the birds that you're gonna see daily. And they come back to these nightly roosts, and there's spots where they bathe before they put down. And you can consistently see the same birds, especially in the breeding season. So like, I have this park I go to on the southeast side of Chicago called Calumet Park. I know that's Hank, that's Shrimpy. Like, I have names for these birds, and they're there all summer. And so one of the neat things you can do right from your car in a Wendy's parking lot. I'm not asking you to throw fries, but if you do, I wouldn't be offended. You can get a juvenile, say in July. And say, okay, I recognize this individual, it has this distinctive pattern on its flanks or greater coverts. And you can watch this bird for a couple months and see exactly those things I was talking about. The scapulars will be replaced first, and then it'll start to fade, and it'll lose some of the brown on the head and breast. So there's nothing more powerful you can do than watch this rather than read about it or look at photographs. If you have the time and you have a regular flock of gulls where you can, like, you're doing your shopping and you stop here and you just check them out in the parking lot, you'll see these progressions. You'll see them. It's very easy to follow if you know what you're looking for.
I'm gonna do one question on Zoom and then we'll get back to the room. Michelle on Zoom asks, when and how do bill changes occur?
Yeah, so it varies from species to species. Some species like Iceland gull keeps a black bill pattern almost for a year. Some species like the glaucous gulls, California gulls, even ring-billed gulls generally start to get a bicolored bill like a month or two after fledging. So it varies from species to species. Some species never change bill color, like little gull, Ross's gull. Franklin's and laughing gull go through like a complete transformation from like reddish maroon bills to all black bills. So it varies really. If you're asking about like herring gull or specific species, we can go into detail.
Cool. Yeah, we'll take.
So related to the photograph you have on the screen there, I'm curious, are any of these species of gulls under particular threats? I mean, we talk a lot about so many birds that are, and curious about any threats gulls might be facing.
In the east, it looks like herring numbers are slightly declining. But ring-billed numbers are increasing. Western gull numbers are increasing. Glaucous wing numbers are down. Here's the thing about gulls and the problem with answering that sort of question is they move around so much. You know, if there's a landfill that's removed, say, those birds will pick up and leave. They will just abandon that whole area. If there are too many bald eagles, for example, setting up around the colony, they just will stop nesting there. They'll move. So we know there's a lot of moving around with gulls, and there aren't enough people per se surveying their numbers. So it's a hard question to answer, but I know herring gulls in the east, some Canadian ornithologists published a paper in 2020, I want to say 22. They saw like a 30% decrease in some places in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia. So that's pretty alarming. We noticed there's less Bonaparte skulls in the winter, so that's one to keep an eye on.
Well, I've heard some of that is potentially due to, like, we don't let like sewage flow into our rivers and lakes, and when that was happening, I think there were large concentrations.
That's interesting. That's very
How about
interesting.
ivory gull? That's one that's probably.
Yeah.
I know, like shit lover.
Yeah.
Ice lover.
Yeah, it's a ice lover, and it's having to survive with less and less ice now. So these birds have to travel farther to find polar bear kills, and they have to travel farther to land on ice because they need to be on ice. They don't actually do a lot of swimming and flying around. They spend a lot of time just on ice and feeding off of the ice edge. But back to
I was gonna say, over the last, say, 15 years or so, there's been lesser black-backed gulls in our area.
Yeah. That one has sharply increased. They've exploded. In 2007, there were 5,000 pairs in Greenland. In 2022, close to when I was finishing this, there's something like 60,000 pairs in Greenland now. And what's interesting is we don't have 60,000 wintering lesser blackbacks in North America, in Canada, and the US. So some of them may be going to Europe for the winter. And the ones we get are probably just a small percentage. But the closest breeding colonies of lesser blackbacks is Southwest Greenland. There hasn't been any confirmed pair of lesser blackbacks breeding anywhere in Canada or US. It's crazy.
So where did the hybrid herrings, lesser blackbacks come from then?
Yeah.
Are those herrings from Europe that are hybridizing with lesser blackbacks?
You're-
And those come here?
Yeah, so some of the lesser blackback herrings that have been photographed and put in eBird, some of them do look like the ones found in Europe. And there's like two different flavors of them. The ones like I've seen with you guys, the landfill here in Bucks County, they look a little different than the ones found in London and France. But this is an exploding hybrid as well. In fact, it's the most common hybrid on the Atlantic now is lesser blackback herring hybrids. They outnumber the Nelson's gull reports. What are Nelson's gulls? Glaucous herring. They outnumber them. They outnumber any other hybrid in the East now. It's your most common hybrid, lesser blackback herring.
Manny?
You had mentioned that the part of the gull nests in trees. Do they build those nests or are they using like previously?
Yeah, no, they build nests, they bring twigs and little sticks to build nests. Yeah, pretty fascinating bird, but I started to say their numbers on the Great Lakes over the last 30 years from west to east are declining. On Lake Erie, on the Niagara River, where that used to be their stronghold, is the Niagara River. You'd have 25, 30,000 of them. Now, if you see a group of 3,000-4,000, that's a good number of Bonapartes. But they are increasing inland in some places on these man-made reservoirs. We had in January this year, 8,000 of them in Alabama, of all places, on the Tennessee River. So they're finding these dams, these small lakes, and feeding on feeder fish. That's what they're doing.
Any more questions on Zoom? Please post in the chat or raise your hands. Let me see if anybody has hands raised. I don't see any. Any questions in the room?
So I don't know anything about breeding gulls and where they nest, where the other gulls nest on the ground.
Yeah, Rocky Islands, in urban areas, oftentimes on rooftops. That is actually a good chunk of our gulls in the lower 48. Coastal birds can be found on rooftops on the Great Lakes, but usually small islands. Yeah, small islands would be the most commonplace down here. Rocky Islands.
Any other questions? All right.
Retool.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Thank you.